In today's video, you're going to see some of the most disrespectful opening play that you've ever seen from the greatest desecrator of traditional chess family values that the world has ever known, Magnus Carlsen. Not only because of the abysmal way that he begins the game, violating every opening principle known to man with the worst move possible, g4, but also because of who he is up against, the great Alireza Firouzja. Nobody should get away with such a thing against a super grandmasterly opponent of this caliber, and Magnus doesn't even play this terrible opening relatively well. After making another couple of pointless pawn pushes and a dubious decision on move 8, he finds himself in a near-lost position. But Magnus has no healthy fear of any mortal, and after only 11 more moves and an astonishing piece sacrifice, oh how the tables have turned. I don't even want to tell you that this is a bullet game because you're just not going to believe me. The winning sequence that Magnus apparently calculates is something that I doubt I would ever be able to work out, even if I had many hours to study the position. So to see Magnus do it in just a matter of seconds makes me want to both jubilantly cheer and violently hurl at the same time. So there's your fair warning. Do whatever you got to do to get your mind right before subjecting yourself to this beautiful abomination. It was played in June of 2019 in the titled arena on lichess.org. Magnus Carlsen has the pallid pieces and he opens with g4, the gruesome Grob. There is no worse way to begin the game as white. This move does not control the center, it weakens the king side, and it allows black to immediately stake his claim in the center with d5 while activating his bishop with an attack on the undefended g4 pawn. Alireza doesn't play that though. Apparently taking inspiration from the children's story The Billy Goat's Gruff, he's decided to try and out-troll chess goat Magnus Carlsen with his response a5. And after bishop to g2 from Magnus, he plays a4. Another move that, aside from gaining a little bit more space, is basically pointless. If this game was a Beatles song, it would definitely have to be I Am the Walrus. We do now get a couple of sensible moves though, with d4 and e6, but then it's right back to crazy town with g5 from Magnus. Now this move does prevent black from immediately developing his knight to its most natural square f6, so that's one coherent thing that can be said about it. However, it also relinquishes control of f5, which is where Alireza's horsey will be grazing in another few moves. First he plays d5, taking some control at e4. It is a good move, as it prevents Magnus from erecting an uncontested central pawn duo with e4, though that would still be a good move for white here, maybe best. But Magnus is still in Dr. Seuss land, and so he decides he better add some unnecessary protection to his pawn on g5 with h4. Now if black had already castled on the king side, this move might make a little more sense, having the potential to contribute to a pawn storming of the black king's castle. But at this early juncture, supporting g5 with a piece-developing move like knight to f3 would have been much better. Alireza responds knight to e7, headed to f5. Was it the best move? Who even cares anymore? The engine liked c5 a bit better, nibbling at white's center, but this move develops a piece which, by the standards of this game, is probably enough to earn it a double exclam. Magnus now puts his knight on c3, which, surprise surprise, is not a good move, as it blocks a pawn that could potentially influence the center. Again, knight to f3 is better, keeping the move c4 on the table. Alireza plops his pony into f5. It is a nice square. c5 was still a bit better, but nobody cares. We now have knight to f3, but ironically, it's no longer a very good move. What Magnus should have played is actually another passive-looking pawn move, and if you can guess what it is, you'll probably know what Alireza should play next. Pause the video and study the position if you so desire. Black's best move is going to be a3. Now if white's knight were still on b1, this would just lose a pawn to knight takes a3, and if black's knight were still on e7, blocking his bishop's access to b4, then white could play b4 with a nice clamp on c5, which is why a3 wasn't a good move until now. So if you don't want black to open the a file by taking on b2, thereby activating his rook, you gotta play b3, allowing black's well-defended pawn to just hang out in your position for who knows how long. Not a good thing. This wasn't played in the game though, where after knight to f3 from Magnus, Alireza plays knight to c6. Magnus develops his bishop to f4. Again, he should have played a3, and once again, a3 is what Alireza should play here, this time with a borderline winning advantage, if in the great fish we trust, but he goes for bishop to d6, challenging Magnus's best good cleric on f4. Magnus makes the trade. We have a recapture by the queen, which is slightly interesting. The Engine liked knight takes d6 a bit better, taking some nice control of some key light squares. But this does get another piece developed, earning Alireza his double exclam number 2 and a possible brilliancy prize. Magnus Carlsen now realizes that a3 is his best move. Not that that necessarily means anything in a game like this, but he goes ahead and plays it. We have b6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to b7, where it might someday enjoy a nice unobstructed view of a friendly pawn on d5, assuming Magnus doesn't allow it to be traded off with something like e4. Better would have been knight c to e7, queen to b6, pressuring b2, followed by knight to d6 and knight to c4, increasing the pressure, in case you wanted to know, since knowing is half the battle. Magnus develops his queen to d2, the bishop goes to b7, and now we have an interesting decision that can't be undone. Magnus castles queenside. It's not a bad move, though the Engine did slightly prefer going after that well-posted steed on f5 with bishop to h3 before black has a chance to redeploy it to the even nicer d6 square, where it's eyeing white's rather porous light-squared complex. So having said that, I probably don't need to tell you why queen to e7 is a good move here for black. Alireza opts for knight to a5 though, which is also pretty good, looking to hop right into c4. Of course, this does relinquish some control of the e5 square, allowing Magnus to now post his knight there, thus utterly preventing an immediate knight to c4, seeing that knight takes c4 and d takes c4 would drop the bishop on b7. But Alireza is not without a plan. He responds f6, booting that knight right out of there, at the cost of weakening his king side a bit. Magnus takes on f6, and after g takes f6, he must now retreat his knight. And if you can guess what the best square for that knight is, you get 35 points and a silver star for the day. Are you ready for this? The computer move, not played by Magnus, is knight to d3, just blocking the defense of the pawn on d4, which if black were to now capture with knight takes d4, or if he plays knight to c4, then white can put his queen on f4, defended by the knight, hitting both the pawn on f6 and the knight on d4. If black plays his best move, e5, then apparently queen to g4 is good, looking to start harassing the black king from h5 next. It's all way too engine-y for my taste. If black trades queens, then after knight takes f4, white is actually winning, as he's still attacking the knight on d4, threatening to kick it away with e3 if it's defended, and then take on e6. If e5 is played, then the d-pawn's going to fall. So there's your token engine line of the game that I don't think any healthy human would ever play, since even here, it's not really obvious why black is hopelessly hosed. But we got to have at least one of these in every game, just to keep our collective ego in check, if nothing else. But getting back to the game, Magnus does not play his strongest move, the ridiculous knight to d3, but rather knight to g4, giving a little tickle to the undefended pawn on f6, which Alireza just ignores and drops his knight into c4, counterattacking the white queen, which if Magnus were to now move to one of the two safe squares that it has, e1 or d3, then black could play queen to f4 check, hitting the hanging knight on g4, which will be lost unless white plays knight to e3. But this wouldn't be much better after knight takes e3, f takes e3, and knight takes e3, threatening a discovered check, hitting the rook, hitting the bishop, and white's pretty much toast. Fortunately for Magnus, he doesn't have to move his queen, because he's got a couple of other options. One of them is knight to b5, counterattacking black's queen. That's very playable. But what about the obvious knight takes f6 check? If you're in the mood for a real challenge, give the video a good long pause and try to determine if knight takes f6 is a good move or a blunder. See if you can calculate how the game would continue with best play from both sides, and then feel free to share your conclusions in the comments, along with your rating. I'm really curious to know what you guys will come up with. Okay, knight takes f6 check is the move played by Magnus, and it's quite a remarkable one as it's very tactically instructive on multiple levels at the same time. At the most rudimentary level, we see that because black's king is in check, there is no knight takes queen on d2, the king must move, and after Alireza's reply, king to f7, I think most of you probably foresaw the little issue that white now has, as both his knight and queen are attacked at the same time. Hopefully you all found queen to g5 as well, answering both threats, defending the knight with the queen. But did you also spot Alireza's next move, h6, attacking the queen again, which now has no way to keep defending the knight? I have to believe that Magnus did when he made the decision to capture that pawn on f6, so how on earth was he able to work out in a bullet game that after his response queen to g4 and Alireza takes his knight on f6, that he isn't just losing here, despite only having one pawn for his lost piece. It's simply unfathomable to me. And when you see what comes next, you're going to understand why. Pause the video if you want to try and find the solitary move that saves White's game in this position. The move, now played by Magnus, is e4, attacking the knight on f5 and threatening a fork of king and queen with e5. So it seems that Black needs to take that pawn on e4, and that is what's played in the game, but it's not the right move. What Black actually needs to do here is attack White's queen with one of his rooks. So after, let's say, rook a to g8, with best play from both sides, the game would continue e5 check with the royal fork, knight takes e5, d takes e5 check, queen takes e5, the white queen moves out of danger, and here's a humdinger of a move for you, bishop to a8, whose sole purpose is to meet rook h to e1 with d4, counterattacking White's queen with the now defended bishop. And then after knight to e4 check, king to e7, bishop to h1, apparently so that knight takes h4 isn't a fork, the engine's giving approximate equality. And we could dig further into all the nuts and bolts of exactly why, or we could just conclude that it must have something to do with the fact that White's king is significantly safer than Black's as we get right back to the game. Where in this position, after e4 from Magnus, Alireza does not put a rook on g8 as he should, but rather plays the quite natural looking, though fatally blunderous, d takes e4. When after bishop takes e4, he's got himself a bit of a big problem. His bishop's under attack, he can't capture on e4 or else knight takes e4 will be a fork of his king and queen. Defending his bishop won't help because then White can just play bishop takes b7 followed by knight to e4. If he blocks the diagonal with c6, then White has bishop to d3, threatening to both win the undefended knight on c4 and execute the knight fork on e4, and Black has no adequate defense. So I ask you, did Magnus have this all worked out when he captured the pawn on f6? Was he just lucky? How does he always seem to know what to play? I've made it clear on several occasions what I personally think is going on, but I do understand that not everyone believes in sorcery, and I respect that. But let's look at what Alireza tries in the game, where in response to bishop takes e4, he plays rook a to g8, attacking the queen. But after queen to f3, maintaining the aforementioned threat of bishop takes b7, to which there is still no adequate defense, Black will be losing a piece. He is a piece up though, which means that after Alireza's king to e7, bishop takes b7 from Magnus, and knight takes d4, we once again have material equality. Black's king is in the center, which isn't great for him, but he's got these two aggressively placed knights, one of which is attacking the white queen. He's got a rook on an open file, also threatening to play c6, trapping the bishop on b7. So not the easiest position in the world to evaluate. Now for a player of Magnus Carlsen's stature, it might not be too insanely difficult to realize that after his next move, queen to e4, Black is totally losing. But to come to that conclusion 7 moves ago, way back when the decision was made to capture the pawn on f6, I don't know guys, I don't know what to believe anymore. But what's going on with this position? Why is Black so utterly shafted here? Well, his knight on d4 is twice attacked, pinned to his queen, so we have c5 defending. At which point, White has a plethora of winning options to choose from, the simplest of which, though by no means the best, is bishop to d5, attacking both the knight on c4 and the pinned pawn on e6. White can follow up with rook to e1, increasing the pressure, maybe sack the exchange on d4, then take on e6, and the Black position is very quickly collapsing. We're not going to go down that gopher hole though, because in this position, Magnus Carlsen commits a blunder with knight to b5, attacking Black's queen. Looks reasonable, and it would be totally winning if not for a tricky move that Black now has. Pause and ponder if you want to try to spot it. The move, not played in the game, is queen to f4 check. Now if White moves his king, then there's just queen takes queen, followed by knight takes b5, and Black wins. If queen takes f4, then we have knight to e2 check, king to b1, and knight takes f4, with a most likely drawn position due to the fact that the queens are now off the board, making the Black king much, much safer. In the game, Alireza misses this 11th hour opportunity to save his game and instead tries queen to e5, which also forces the trade of queens due to his threat of knight to e2 check followed by queen takes b2. However, after queen takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes d4, c takes d4, and rook takes d4, Magnus is a pawn up and is threatening to win another one with rook takes a4. If b5 defending, then he'll just play rook to b4 going after the b pawn, and Black has no good defense. He'd love to infiltrate to g2, of course, but the bishop has that square covered. So we have rook to g4, defending that way. Magnus plays f4 with a potential attack on the knight, though not yet threatening to win it since the pawn is pinned to the rook. The engine liked rook to d1 much better, but this seems to be winning as well, so we'll go ahead and press on. Alireza tries rook to f8, going after the pawn on f4, but after rook takes a4, rook f takes f4, and a strong move by Magnus, rook to a6, Black is without a whisper of hope, mainly because he's got no good way to save his b-pawn. And then after White wins it, he'll have this connected pass-pawn trio versus Black's weak split pawns on the king side, giving him an easy win. Playing b5 doesn't work, since that would just open the rook's eyes to the pawn on e6, which would then come under insufferable pressure with moves like bishop to c8 and rook to e1. Alireza tries knight to d7, defending that way. Magnus plays bishop to c6, attacking the defender. It goes to c5. Rook takes h4 was playable, but Alireza is undoubtedly trying to avoid trading pieces so that he has a better chance of drumming up some kind of last-minute trickery. Magnus captures on b6, we have rook to c4, pinning the pawn on c2 to the king. This doesn't immediately threaten anything, but Magnus goes ahead and plays king to b1 anyway, breaking the pin. We have rook g to f4, most likely preparing rook to f2 to attack c2. Magnus preempts that with c3. Alireza continues knight to d3, eyeing b2 now, ready to increase the pressure with rook to f2. But this move is tactically flawed, as Magnus now demonstrates with bishop to b5, with a deadly skewer of rook and knight. A turn of events which convinces Alireza to now resign the game. He could try knight to f2, counterattacking the rook on h1, but after bishop takes c4, knight takes h1, and rook takes e6 check, Black is left with a 3-pawn deficit and no hope of survival. So was that not one of the most incredible bullet performances you've ever seen? Magnus really walked a flimsy tightrope on this one, with such a narrow path to victory, and one that seemed to require a simply inhuman depth of calculation. I don't know what else I can say. I'm at a loss for any further explanation, so I think I'll just leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already and enjoyed the content. Leave a like and/or a comment. Those things really help tickle the algorithm. And I will see you next time.